This is a strange series that we're beginning on. It's about being a godly woman in an ungodly world. And I titled it that so when Jaden put it online, people looking for women's Bible studies could find it. That's the key word. But as I thought about what to study next, I thought, I believe I want to take the issues that over maybe 55 years of ministry, women have come to me about things that were hurting them, that they could not cope with. Some found mercy from the Lord and carried on, and some went by the wayside. So I decided to start with the big one first, facing life's catastrophes. Because we will all have those in our life, and some seem to have many. Now, catastrophe I'm defining as something that's almost unbearable. It's when your husband says, I've been having an affair with somebody and I'm leaving you. Now that, your life is never the same after that. It's when your husband or a child dies, and your life is never the same after that. It's when the doctor looks you in the face and says, I'm sorry, this is stage 4 cancer, and we don't have anything that you can count on helping you. Your life has changed forever. Or when your house burns down and you lose everything you ever had. These things are catastrophes. Well, I want us to look toward 3 scriptures. The first one is Psalm 66, which is a wonderful psalm full of cheer and good news. But it also has a description of the impact of things that are catastrophes. And I want us to know how God describes what we're talking about. Beautiful word pictures. If you will look at Psalm 66, verse 10. The psalmist is praying. He's talking to God. And first of all, he says, For thou, O God, hast proved us. That Hebrew word for prove means to prove by a test. Any of you ever have chemistry in school? You remember when they handed you some unknown substance and gave you some tests to go through to figure out what it was? And you pounded it, and you heated it, and you mixed it with water. You had to do all these things to figure out, to test it and see what it was. But God made elements to always have the same characteristics. And if you did your test right, you could figure out what it was, because it always responds in the same way. And that's the word here. God has proved us. He has put us through the fire. He has mixed us in drowning water. The second phrase of verse 10 says, You have tried us as silver is tried. And the Hebrew word translated tried there is talking about refining silver, where silver is heated to a liquid state, and then the impurities in it come up to the surface, and the refiner can spoon those off. Like we do when we cook purple whole peas and all that gray stuff comes up to the top. You just get rid of that. Thou hast tried us. And some of these trials make you feel like you've been heated on a stove to the melting point. And I know I am talking to ladies who have, somebody in this room has experienced these things. And then verse 11 says, Thou brought us into the net. And I knew what brought meant, but when I looked it up, I found out it was not only an action, a verb, but it was intentional. God brought us into a net. And it speaks of the net used in fishing or in hunting to capture a fish. That fish had many options once it was in the net. Isn't that what a catastrophe feels like? Now, Satan brings stuff like this too, but this verse says God at times does that. Thou hast laid affliction on our loins. Affliction means distress or stress. Anybody have any of that this morning? The word loins means the small of the back. Any of you have low back pain? Do any of you not have low back pain? Might be the thing I ask. Do you see how uncomfortable all these descriptors are? Verse 12, you have caused men to ride over our heads. Now that's a strange, a strange phrase. One translation has, you have caused men to ride on our shoulders. The word ride in the Hebrew means riding on an animal or in some kind of cart, wagon, or chariot, or any burden that you're carrying. But to carry a person, you have caused men to ride on our backs. That must be their conquerors. It would be hard to carry a man on his shoulders or on a back. I put for you the reference in Isaiah 51 because my Bible had that at that verse, and I had read it, but I had never seen anything in it. It talks about the enemies of Israel did this, and they laid them on the ground, and they drove their chariots over their bodies. Now that's crushing, isn't it? And then, as if all this is not bad enough, the last part of verse 12 says we went through what? Fire and water. Do you ever feel like you've been through fire? Bethany, did you go through fire to get here, honey? With all those little lives you're responsible for. Now, when I studied the Word, I found out that both fire and water can be figurative or literal. And we speak of going through fiery trials. That's a way we use it. Was there anybody in the Bible that ever actually went through fire? Who was that? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were in literal fire. Did God bring them out? He did. Anybody ever go through water? Moses. Now God opened the water for him. I cannot see this imagery without thinking about, what is it, Isaiah 43, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overflow you. And I will tell you, the one time I went whitewater rafting, that verse I clung to. I was terrified. But that verse ends, when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. Isn't that amazing that God uses those two images throughout the Old Testament? Well, these things, these catastrophic events, people who go through such a thing today are often tormented by what is called a mental disorder afterwards. I'm talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's actually how people feel when any of these things happen. They feel that way. But I am appalled at one of the treatment methods that's practiced today, and it's called exposure therapy, where you relive and rethink that terrible thing over and over and over. We've had some men who were sex offenders, and when they went to their counseling groups, they had to talk about what they did over and over and over. Now, I'm not the sharpest psychological tool in the shed, but I know that that is not biblical, because we are told in Scripture in Philippians 4:8, what are we to think about? What's true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report with virtue and praise. And certainly the disaster is not that. And then we're also told in Proverbs, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. We need to be so careful what we think about. But then the last phrase says, God did all these things, but you what? Brought us into a wealthy place. Now, I shuddered at the word wealthy because I thought, oh, all the name it and claim it preachers will go to town on this. And actually, the word wealth does not translate the Hebrew word. That could be maybe a third or fourth meaning of the Hebrew word. The first meaning is, you have brought us to satisfaction. Satisfaction? And the Hebrew word for satisfaction has its root of when you're dying of thirst and you get some water. It means to quench your thirst. Do you mean when I'm in a catastrophe, God can quench all of that and bring me to a point where I'm satisfied? Now, as I thought about this, I thought about catastrophes in my life. And I've had a few. Some days I feel like my whole life is a catastrophe because everything I plan to fix becomes unfixed. I think you know that my mother had Alzheimer's for an inordinate length of time, more than 30 years. And it was like the H word. Now, I think God was wanting to bring me through that. But what I did was I was angry. And I'm ashamed to tell you that I said to God, why are you doing this to us? We're your friends. You might want to do this to some of your enemies. Don't do it to me. Can you believe that? And I'm just like your little kid when you're trying to make them do something and they are throwing a tantrum. And you try to pick them up and they arch their back. You can't even get a grip on them. Have you ever had a tantrum to God? That is certainly not the place of satisfaction, is it? And I thought, Lord, you're talking about me. You're talking about me. I don't want to be that way. That's why that little kid is on your sheet screaming. That's to remind you what happens when you are not satisfied. I found from an old book that John Piper wrote. He said, getting through catastrophes requires being satisfied with the means that God has used that brought them on. Being okay. Instead of saying, God, if you don't change this, I can't stand it. You say, Lord, you allowed this, and you'll bring me out sometime. And I'm okay. Isn't that an amazing truth? I don't want to be like the little girl screaming and arching my back. Well, that's what the Old Testament says about catastrophes. Let's look in the New Testament. And I put these verses on your sheet so you wouldn't have to turn to these. I know that we all know John 16:33, where Jesus said, in the world you will have tribulation. You will have catastrophes. My husband calls this the promise of Christ that nobody wants to claim. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. Why? Now, I hate it when I'm in a twit and somebody says, cheer up. And that's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying, you can rest on this. I have overcome the world. This verse is spoken in the context of chapter 15, where Jesus is talking to the disciples at the Last Supper. As soon as they leave there, he's going to the garden to pray, and what happens? He's arrested. He's tortured. He's crucified. And he said, I have overcome the world. Look at John 15:11. Why is he talking about bad things? He said, these things have I spoken to you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. What? That's why Jesus said, be of good cheer. He's saying, have my joy. Do you think when he said that, the disciples said, what do you mean your joy? Or do you think they had seen that in his life? He had many enemies, and they attacked him mercilessly during his 3 years. I want you all to know that I wasn't thinking about any of you when I did this lesson, but I know that's very applicable to something some of you are facing. He said, I want my joy to be in you, that joy that doesn't matter. He had that joy that he was all right with what God the Father wanted him to do. He was satisfied. The joy of Jesus is not what we call joy. We call a life of ease where everything goes well. That's our joy. But Jesus' joy was to obey the Father and to trust in him. Be satisfied. I think I'm old enough to remember the old Rolling Stones song, I can't get no satisfaction. That's the song of the world. And if I am not satisfied in my heart with God, it just shows there's something of the world that's in my heart. Well, another passage I want to look at is the end all for catastrophes, I guess, Romans 8:28. So if you need to, turn there. You may know that. I bet we could just about say it together. And we know that all things work together for good to them who love God and are. But how do you apply that verse when what's happening to you is not good? Cancer is not good. Death is not good. Loss is not good. Let's look at what the words mean, and then we'll talk about this. First of all, Paul starts his sentence with, we know. Now, I like that because it's an inclusive pronoun, we. Who is Paul writing to? Roman Christians. He's writing. How many people were in the Roman church at this time? We don't know, but probably wasn't a church of 1,000. And what was happening to people who were Christians? Little persecution. Oh, death. Fed to lions. I think my life is bad. Now that's hard. And Paul said, we know. Now I know what no means. But I looked it up just to be sure I knew what it meant. And I was surprised to see in the Greek there are 2 words that are translated know. This one means we have complete knowledge of a situation. Not we're trying to figure this out. Not we'll understand this by and by. We know. Now, the other Greek word translated know is gnosko, which is the word for sexual relation between a husband and a wife. The Bible uses that word, we know each other. Now, ladies, before you were married, you thought you knew your husband. Your wedding night, you knew him a lot better. And every year since then, you've known him more and more and more. You know. James is surprised when I know what he wants. I know him. But the word Paul used is, we know this. We're not trying to believe this in our mind. We're not trying to figure this out. We know that, and then the King James says what? That all things work together for good. English majors, what's the verb in that phrase? Work. What's the subject? What's working? Uh-oh. Is this fate? Fate is doing all this stuff. Look on your sheet. I've given you some various translations. The first one is the King James. All things work together for good to them that love God. The middle one is the New American Standard Bible. God causes all things to work together for good. Now, I like that better, but I don't like it because it sounds like things happen and God says, well, I'll make this work out. And He comes to us after they happen and He'll work it out. Actually, this is one time I like the NIV, the new NIV. In all things, who is working? God works. Now, that keys it. Why are they so different in different Bibles? Two things: different manuscripts they're working from, and different Greek grammatical rules. So, but one preacher said, if you put God at the end of that verse, you'll never make it. If you put Him at the beginning of that verse, you'll understand. You'll know. It is God working. Because in that Psalm 66, who was doing all that bad stuff to the people? God did it. He brought them in a net. He made their enemies right over their heads. He brought them through the fire and the water. He was doing that. He had a purpose. In reality, God is there at the beginning and at the middle and at the end of all of our tragedies. And He is working sovereignly. He is not a ruler with dementia. He's not a king with very poor judgment. He's not lacking information about our situation. And hey, unlike our government people, He does not have a personal agenda except to make us like Him. Now, it's hard for me to understand how God brings hard things on us, because I don't like hard things. And I don't like to do mean things to other people. Can anything stop God from working in that thing that is or has been killing me? Is there anything? Lou is shaking her head no. She already knows. She knows nothing can stop God from working out His purpose. The sins of others do not stop God from working out His purpose. Think of Joseph, what his brothers did to him. And he himself said in the last chapter of Genesis, you meant it for evil. But what? God used it for good to save the nation of Egypt and the Israelites from being wiped off the planet. Now, sometimes we think this would be good if so-and-so would stop doing something. Us fixers do. Nothing stops God from working sovereignly in my heart. And then, what about my sins? I don't know what the devil says to you. I'm sure this is him. He says to me, why do you bother to study? God won't ever show you anything. You sin too much. Why, just a while ago you said that thing you shouldn't have said. Just a while ago you ate your 8th cookie. Or thought the thought, or hated that person and wished that person was not alive. Even our sins can't stop God from working out his purpose. I've given you the reference for where Paul was before kings in the book of Acts, and he was giving them his testimony, and he said, I had a severe anger problem, and I persecuted people and hated them, and I killed people. Well, I've never killed anybody that I know of, but I've had an anger problem, and I've had a hatred problem. That doesn't stop God from working. So we know that God works all things together for the good of whom? Those who love God. You know, because of Christian families, I think if I went in the nursery and said, how many of you babies love God? That they would say they did. Because I grew up loving God. I was told we're supposed to love God. And I loved him in my childish ways. If I ask y'all, do you love God? Or do you get irritated at his purpose sometimes? Why do we love God? I've given you the reference, 1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us. You see, people that aren't saved can't really love God, because when something happens they don't like, they back off. And if you love God, I just want you to know that's a treasure. That means you're saved if you love God. All right, to those who love God and who are called. Romans 8, that's where we are. 1 Corinthians 1:2 says we are called to be saints. 1 Timothy 1:9 says God saved us and called us with a holy calling. He's calling us to a life of holiness. But now you have to peek down into verse 29 of Romans 8. Why is God doing all this? Why is he bringing all this? What is his purpose? What does he want this cake to look like when it's baked here? Verse 29 says that we might be conformed to the image of his Son, that we might be like Jesus, that we might have his joy in us, that we may view the things that hurt us in our life with the viewpoint of Christ. God has allowed this. I don't understand why, but he is working. And someday I'll know. Maybe here, maybe there. Someday I will know. I have known believers who suffered great difficulties to the end of their life, and they never got relief. And I will tell you, I have just known a handful that could be satisfied in that situation. I think those of you in our church remember Claudette. When she had 4 children still at home, she got the stage 4 cancer diagnosis. The youngest was about 12 or 13. And she prayed, Lord, if you will let me live until the youngest one graduates, I'd sure be happy. And he did. And the week after he graduated, that disease just went wild and took her in a few months. But you know, Claudette wasn't down in the mouth. And if she called you, she encouraged you. You didn't have to encourage her. She was satisfied with where God had her. Even in that place, it can be done. All right, that's what I have about dealing with catastrophes. And I'm glad to mention Claudette, because I don't think anybody who knew her thought, is that woman really a Christian? Did they? That's what God wants us to be, conformed to the image of his Son and a witness to those around. Now, at some point in this series, we're going to talk about the stresses of everyday life. Do y'all have them? A bunch? And the answers for that lesson are maybe a little bit different, but I wanted to start with this one because if we can get hold of being satisfied with what is happening to us, knowing that God allowed it, what a difference there.